more than 92,000 soldiers had been seriously wounded. Seriously wounded. More than 92,000 soldiers had been seriously wounded. This is one that blows me away. You think about this. And this is back in 1967, not today. By the end of 1967, the financial cost of the Vietnam War was costing the United States of America, kiddos, $1 million per day. $1 million a day in 1967. That'd probably be $10 million today. $1 million a day. Now, if you're an American citizen, are you going, geez, $1 million a day by the end of '67, and this thing went 7 more years. Now, I don't know if it averaged that, but it went a lot longer, right? Okay, number 4. By the end of 1967, the only war that America had fought in that had been longer than Vietnam was the Revolutionary War. It was the second longest war in American history, and we're still 6 or 7 years away from it being over. Does that make sense? It definitely is going to be the longest war in American history by the time we're done. But at the time, by the end of 1967, it had dragged on and it had become the second longest war in American history. And I don't think anybody back in the United States was comparing the Vietnam War to the Revolutionary War. You know what I'm saying? As far as the importance of it. Here's another interesting statistic. Number 5, by the end of 1967, now I want you to think about this. If you listen to a half-hour news broadcast on ABC, 90% of it was dedicated to what? Vietnam War. 90% of the broadcast, whether it be 30 minutes an hour, 90% of that broadcast was generally dedicated to the events happening in Vietnam. And they also estimated that about 50 million people a night watch the nightly news. It isn't like now, you guys are so busy, and your parents are busy. Do your parents go home and watch the nightly news every night? You think, I'm telling you, my dad, and I'm older than you, obviously. My dad would have been, 90-some years old. He came home every night from work, sat down, and watched the 6 o'clock news. Every single night. Went for a half hour, we ate, he went back and watched some television programs and relaxed, and when the 10 o'clock news came on, he watched that. That's what he did every day. That's what you did in those days. You didn't have all this stuff, okay? 50 million people watched that night. They knew exactly what was going on in Vietnam, right? And this is important, number 6. By the end of 1967, this opposition that's starting to brew is going to make it impossible for the United States of America to win this war. The opposition is going to make it impossible for the military to gain a victory. It's not going to happen. We're not going to win in Vietnam. We've got too many people speaking out against it. You can't win in anything if you're divided, can you? I don't care if it's basketball or speech and debate. If you got a partner and your partner doesn't believe in what you're doing, you're going to win your debate contest? Absolutely not. The United States is in a very, very tough position here. So, let's think about this, Aaron Vigil. If you were President Johnson and you could see the year of 1967 coming to an end, and you're not wanting to have a bad 1968, what might you do to give a pep talk to the people of America and tell them, you know what, things aren't quite as bad as you think they are? Who might you consider? Well, first of all, you might want to find out if you're really winning or not. Okay? Who would you go to for that? Who would Johnson go to? I haven't told you. I'm just trying to get you to guess. Who might he turn to get it from the horse's mouth what's going on in Vietnam? Okay, who's the most important person in Vietnam, probably militarily? The overall commander of American forces, right? And it just so happened that that was a guy by the name of General William Westmoreland, that guy right there. So what Johnson does is he calls General William Westmoreland back from Saigon in South Vietnam, and he sits down with him, and what's he want to ask him? How's it going down there? Now, really, these people are hearing all this stuff. We've had some casualties, and this has been a long son of a gun. Are we winning this thing or not? Are we going to win it or not? Is it a hopeless cause, or are we getting after it a little bit here? I need to hear it from the guy that knows most. And what does Westmoreland tell Johnson? I think he honestly believed this. He thought they were winning the war. He didn't say, we're making progress. We're doing so good a couple years ago, but we're really, I can see light at the end of the tunnel, is what he tells Johnson. So what does Johnson do after he hears that? What's that? That's what everybody says, and that would make the most sense, but he doesn't give the address. Who does he have give the address? General Westmoreland. He has Westmoreland publicly state to the American people what's going on in Vietnam. Wouldn't that make more sense? It's coming straight from where? The horse's mouth, the guy that's there. So, Westmoreland agrees to do that. Well, on November 21st of 1967, Westmoreland publicly assures the American people that things are just fine in Vietnam. And I'm going to read his quote. And again, you don't have to do it word for word. You can just paraphrase in your notes what you think you got out of it. But this is what Westmoreland tells the American people on November 21st, 1967. He tells them this about the military progress in Vietnam. He says, quote, I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. There are indications that both the Viet Cong and even Hanoi know this. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view. What's he told them? We were losing in 65, but we're winning now. Even the Viet Cong and the governmental leaders in Hanoi know this, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think he really believed that. And maybe he was kind of right. Now, surprisingly, people took that pretty well. And the questioning kind of slowed down and optimism rose. And by the end of 1967, Johnson kind of had people believing we were doing the right thing. Unfortunately, 10 weeks later, an event called the Tet Offensive is going to change Americans' view on military truth or non-truth forever. And that's our next subtopic, the Tet Offensive. Sad thing, I think Westmoreland believed it totally. But he couldn't anticipate what was going to happen on January 31st of 1968. An event we know in American history as the Tet Offensive. So again, I believe strongly that Westmoreland thought we were doing pretty good, and he could not predict what was going to happen in South Vietnam on January 31st, 1968, the Tet Offensive. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but what's our first day of the year called? New Year's Day. What day is it? January 1st. Just so happens that the Vietnamese New Year starts on January 31st. And they don't call it New Year's Day, they call it Tet. Okay? So something must have happened on the Vietnamese New Year of Tet on January 31st, 1968. Now, what shouldn't happen on New Year's Day? Fighting. Very good, my dear. It's a war holiday. That's been the rule forever, since the Revolutionary War. Although George Washington, remember, broke that on Christmas Day, but he was fighting the Hessians. They weren't even, they weren't the British, right? Well, anyway, what happens on this day is the Viet Cong launch military strikes all over South Vietnam at both military and civilian targets. And we are not prepared because it is a war holiday and we get totally taken by surprise. You're not supposed to do this. So Westmoreland's telling everybody we're winning, and all of a sudden on January 31st of 1968, we are facing a serious problem when Viet Cong guerrillas launch massive attacks on South Vietnam on the Vietnamese New Year Day, 31st of January, known as Tet. Within a 24-hour period, 84,000 Viet Cong guerrillas attacked 3 specific areas in South Vietnam of significance. In a 24-hour period, 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers attacked 3 specific areas in South Vietnam of significance. First of all, they attacked more than 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns. They attacked more than 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns. Who's that army? Civilians. Secondly, they attacked 12 different United States military bases in South Vietnam. They attacked 12 different United States military bases in South Vietnam. And then they commit the ultimate no-no. What do they attack next? No, it's something that is sacred. You do not attack this. What? The United States Embassy in Saigon. You just don't do that. That is sovereign ground. So they attacked more than 40 different cities and towns in South Vietnam. They attacked 12 separate United States military bases in South Vietnam. And they even had the gall to attack the United States Embassy, which is located in Spain, in Saigon. Now, this doesn't last overnight. And I will just tell you that in the first 48 hours of fighting during the Tet Offensive, 232 American soldiers were killed and approximately 900 were wounded in the first 48 hours of fighting. First 48 hours as they're trying to defend those cities, and those military bases, and that embassy. If you imagine on national television our soldiers protecting our embassy from the North Vietnamese. 232 Americans are killed, over 900 are wounded in that first 48 hours. And guess what Americans are seeing every single night for the next 2 nights on TV? Footage of the Tet Offensive. And they just got told we're winning. Now, the most notable military base that was under siege by the North Vietnamese was the one at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh was the most notable military base. You know how long the battle for Khe Sanh lasted? You know how long North Vietnamese forces fought American and South Vietnamese forces at Khe Sanh? 77 days. 77 days that battle for Khe Sanh went on. The longest individual battle in the history of the Vietnam War. 77-day long battle. And that was at Khe Sanh. And that battle finally ended on April 8th of 1968. April 8th, 1968. After 77 days of battle, the Americans and South Vietnamese finally overcame the North Vietnamese guerrillas and secured Khe Sanh back for them. It came at a price, though, because 274 Americans were killed and 2,500 wounded in the battle for Khe Sanh. 274 Americans were killed and 2,500 more wounded. Now this is where it gets interesting, where you kind of get the mentality of the North Vietnamese. They estimated that 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers fought at Khe Sanh. 20,000. Guess how many were killed? Pretty close. Over 10,000 killed. Over 10,000 were killed. We lost 200 and how many? 74. And I mean, we're mad. Okay? 274. They lost over 10,000. Now, how many Viet Cong soldiers did I tell you fought the Tet Offensive? 84,000. When this thing ended, 70% of those those North Vietnamese guerrillas were killed. 70%. What's 70%?
By the this quick announcement. If you have homework lunch or lunch detention today, it will not be with Mr. Dorn, it will be with Mrs.
How many
Keltner.
names we got on the
Again,
Vietnam
if you have
Wall?
homework lunch or
We
lunch
got
detention,
58,000,
it
and
will
we're
be
mad
in
about
Mrs.
it, and we
Keltner's
should
room.
be.
Thank you.
58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. They lost 58,000 in 3 months. And nobody cared, to be quite frank, because that's their mentality, which we'll get to way later. Okay? So they lost as many as we have on the wall in 3 months. Okay? That was their mentality. So consider that if you would. Now, here's where we end for the day. Guess who was in Vietnam for 1 week covering the Vietnam War and happened to be there during the Tet Offensive and watched it firsthand? No? Someone that could really make a difference media-wise. Come on, who's the best? What?
Was it Robert Kennedy?
No, who's the best who's the...
The Stoic?
Walter Cronkite, the most famous journalist in American history, just happens to be in Vietnam to see what's going on for himself. And while he's there, what happens? The Tet Offensive. And he's not reporting from inside a bulletproof building. You know where he's at reporting this? In the fight. He's got the helmet on. He's got the military gear on. These people reported the Vietnam War while people were shooting at him. That's how they did it. And he watches this firsthand. And he comes back to the United States after listening to Westmoreland and being there firsthand, and he says, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." That's what he says when he gets back. But that's not where he did the most damage to Johnson. Because on February 27, 1968, we're not done at Khe Sanh, are we? This thing is still going on. He just happened to come back. And he gives this nightly report on CBS News. And he always ended with, "And that's the way it was." You know, February 27th, 1968. Then he's done. Well, before he did that, he finished his reporting, and this is what he said to the American people on national news. This is what he said. Paraphrase it as you wish. So again, on February 27th, 1968, on his nightly CBS News post, he ends his national television report by saying, quote, "To this reporter, it seems now more than certain that the bloody experience in Vietnam is to end in a stalemate, and that the only rational way out will be to negotiate." What's he telling the American people? We cannot win, and the best way to get out of this mess is to negotiate your way out. Who was one of the 50 million viewers listening to that evening? Lyndon Johnson in the Oval Office. And he turned to one of his personal aides after hearing Walter Cronkite, and he said, quote, "If I've lost Walter, then it's all over. I've lost Mr. Average Citizen." And he was right. When he lost the support of Walter Cronkite, when Walter Cronkite got on national television and said, "I've been there, basically. This thing is at best a tie. We better get to negotiating," that was the beginning of the end for Lyndon Johnson. 2 days after Cronkite's speech, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara resigned, and a fellow by the name of Clark Clifford became Secretary of Defense, and that's kind of crucial later. So 2 days after Walter Cronkite's stunning revelation about the Vietnam War, Secretary of Defense, who served both under Kennedy and Johnson, Robert McNamara, resigned, and Clark Clifford was named his replacement. Can you imagine the pressure that McNamara was under? My God, how did I be the Secretary of Defense during this mess? Seriously, it almost killed him. I mean, he was in terrible, physical and mental shape because of this. Okay, tomorrow, here's what we're going to tell you.